Monday morning at Julian's, students fought for places. Students with prior claims drove away others who had been anxiously squatting on coveted tabourets since the door was opened in hopes of appropriating them at roll call. Students squabbled over pallets, brushes, portfolios, or rent the air with demands for cicerai and bread. The former, a dirty ex-model who had in Palmier days posed as Judas, now dispensed stale bread at 1 sou and made enough to keep himself in cigarettes. Monsieur Julien walked in, smiled a fatherly smile, and walked out. His disappearance was followed by the apparition of the clerk, a foxy creature who flitted through the battling hordes in search of prey. 3 men who had not paid dues were caught and summoned. A 4th was scented, followed, outflanked, his retreat towards the door cut off, and finally captured behind the stove. About that time, the revolution assuming an acute form, howls rose for Jules. Jules came, umpired 2 fights with a sad resignation in his big brown eyes, shook hands with everybody and melted away in the throng, leaving an atmosphere of peace and goodwill. The lions sat down with the lambs, the massiers marked the best places for themselves and friends, and mounting the model stands, opened the roll calls. The word was passed, they begin with C this week. They did. Clisson jumped like a flash and marked his name on the floor in chalk before a front seat. Caron galloped away to secure his place. Bang went an easel. Nom de Dieu in French. Where in hell are you going in English? Crash. A paintbox fell with brushes and all on board. Dieu de spat. A blow, a short rush, a clinch and scuffle, and the voice of the massier, stern and reproachful. Cochon. Then the roll call was resumed. Clifford. The massier paused and looked up, one finger between the leaves of the ledger. Clifford. Clifford was not there. He was about 3 miles away in a direct line, and every instant increased the distance. Not that he was walking fast. On the contrary, he was strolling with that leisurely gait peculiar to himself. Elliot was beside him, and 2 bulldogs covered the rear. Elliot was reading the Gil Blas, from which he seemed to extract amusement, but deeming boisterous mirth unsuitable to Clifford's state of mind, subdued his amusement to a series of discreet smiles. The latter, moodily aware of this, said nothing, but leading the way into the Luxembourg Gardens, installed himself upon a bench by the northern terrace and surveyed the landscape with disfavor. Elliot, according to the Luxembourg regulations, tied the 2 dogs, and then, with an interrogative glance toward his friend, resumed the Gil Blas and the discreet smiles. The day was perfect. The sun hung over Notre Dame, setting the city in a glitter. The tender foliage of the chestnuts cast a shadow over the terrace and flecked the paths and walks with tracery so blue that Clifford might here have found encouragement for his violent impressions had he but looked. But as usual in this period of his career, his thoughts were anywhere except in his profession. Around about, the sparrows quarreled and chattered their courtship songs. The big rosy pigeons sailed from tree to tree, the flies whirled in the sunbeams, and the flowers exhaled 1,000 perfumes which stirred Clifford with languorous wistfulness. Under this influence he spoke. "Elliot, you are a true friend." "You make me ill," replied the latter, folding his paper. "It's just as I thought. You are tagging after some new petticoat again. And," he continued wrathfully, "if this is what you've kept me away from Julian's for, if it's to fill me up with the perfections of some little idiot—" "Not idiot," remonstrated Clifford gently. "See here," cried Elliot, "have you the nerve to try to tell me that you are in love again?" "Again?" "Yes, again and again and again, and by George, have you." "This," observed Clifford sadly, "is serious." For a moment Elliot would have laid hands on him, then he laughed from sheer helplessness. "Oh, go on, let's see, there's Clémence and Marie Telec and Cosette and Fifine, Colette, Marie Verdier, all of whom are charming, most charming, but I never was serious." "So help me, Moses," said Elliot solemnly. "Each and every one of those named have separately and in turn torn your heart with anguish, and have also made me lose my place at Julian's in this same manner. Each and every one separately and in turn. Do you deny it? What you say may be founded on facts in a way, but give me the credit of being faithful to one at a time, until the next came along. But this is really very different. Elliot, believe me, I am all broken up." Then, there being nothing else to do, Elliot gnashed his teeth and listened. It's Rue Barrée." "Well," observed Elliot with scorn, "if you are moping and moaning over that girl, the girl who has given you and myself every reason to wish that the ground would open and engulf us, well, go on." "I'm going on, I don't care. Timidity has fled." "Yes, your native timidity." "I'm desperate, Elliot. Am I in love? Never did I feel so and miserable. I can't sleep. Honestly, I'm incapable of eating properly." Same symptoms noticed in the case of Colette. Listen, will you? Hold on a moment, I know the rest by heart. Now let me ask you something. Is it your belief that Rue Barrée is a pure girl? Yes, said Clifford, turning red. Do you love her? Not as you dangle and tiptoe after every pretty inanity. I mean, do you honestly love her? Yes, said the other doggedly. I would... Hold on a moment, would you marry her? Clifford turned scarlet. Yes, he muttered. Pleasant news for your family, growled Elliot in suppressed fury. Dear father, I have just married a charming grisette whom I'm sure you'll welcome with open arms, in company with her mother, a most estimable and cleanly washed lady. Good heavens, this seems to have gone a little further than the rest. Thank your stars, young man, that my head is level enough for us both. Still, in this case, I have no fear. Rue Barrée sat on your aspirations in a manner unmistakably final. Rue Barrée, began Clifford, drawing himself up, but he suddenly ceased, for there, where the dappled sunlight glowed in spots of gold along the sun-flecked path, tripped Rue Barrée. Her gown was spotless, and her big straw hat, tipped a little from the white forehead, threw a shadow across her eyes. Elliot stood up and bowed. Clifford removed his head covering with an air so plaintive, so appealing, so utterly humble that Rue Barrée smiled. The smile was delicious, and when Clifford, incapable of sustaining himself on his legs from sheer astonishment, toppled slightly, she smiled again in spite of herself. A few moments later she took a chair on the terrace and, drawing a book from her music roll, turned the pages, found the place, and then placing it open downwards in her lap, sighed a little, smiled a little, and looked out over the city. She had entirely forgotten Foxhall Clifford. After a while she took up her book again, but instead of reading began to adjust a rose in her corsage. The rose was big and red. It glowed like fire there over her heart, and like fire it warmed her heart, now fluttering under the silken petals. Rue Barrée sighed again. She was very happy. The sky was so blue, the air so soft and perfumed, the sunshine so caressing, and her heart sang within her, sang to the rose in her breast. This is what it sang. Out of the throng of passers-by, out of the world of yesterday, out of the millions passing, one has turned aside to me. So her heart sang under his rose on her breast. Then two big mouse-colored pigeons came whistling by and alighted on the terrace, where they bowed and strutted and bobbed and turned until Rue Barrée laughed in delight, and looking up beheld Clifford before her. His hat was in his hand, and his face was wreathed in a series of appealing smiles which would have touched the heart of a Bengal tiger. For an instant Rue Barrée frowned. Then she looked curiously at Clifford. Then, when she saw the resemblance between his bows and the bobbing pigeons, in spite of herself, her lips parted in the most bewitching laugh. Was this Rue Barrée? So changed that she did not know herself, but oh, that song in her heart which drowned all else, which trembled on her lips, struggling for utterance, which rippled forth in a laugh at nothing, at a strutting pigeon, and Mr. Clifford. And you think, because I return the salute of the students in the quarter, that you may be received in particular as a friend? I do not know you, monsieur, but vanity is man's other name. Be content, Monsieur Vanity, I shall be punctilious. Oh, most punctilious in returning your salute. But I beg, I implore you to let me render you that homage which has so long— Oh dear, I don't care for homage. Let me only be permitted to speak to you now and then, occasionally, very occasionally. And if you, why not another? Not at all, I will be discretion itself. Discretion, why? Her eyes were very clear, and Clifford winced for a moment, but only for a moment. Then the devil of recklessness seizing him, he sat down and offered himself, soul and body, goods and chattels. And all the time he knew he was a fool, and that infatuation is not love, and that each word he uttered bound him in honor from which there was no escape. And all the time Elliot was scowling down on the Fountain Plaza and savagely checking both bulldogs from their desire to rush to Clifford's rescue, for even they felt there was something wrong as Elliot stormed within himself and growled maledictions. When Clifford finished, he finished in a glow of excitement, but Rue Barrée's response was long in coming, and his ardor cooled while the situation slowly assumed its just proportions. Then regret began to creep in, but he put that aside and broke out again in protestations. At the first word, Rue Barrée checked him. I thank you, she said, speaking very gravely. No man has ever before offered me marriage. She turned and looked out over the city. After a while, she spoke again. You offer me a great deal. I am alone. I have nothing. I am nothing. She turned again and looked at Paris, brilliant, fair, in the sunshine of a perfect day. He followed her eyes. Oh, she murmured, it is hard to work always. Always alone, with never a friend you can have in honor. and the love that is offered means the streets, the boulevard, when passion is dead. I know it, we others who have nothing, have no one, and who give ourselves unquestioning when we love, yes, unquestioning heart and soul, knowing the end. She touched the rose at her breast. For a moment she seemed to forget him, then quietly, I thank you, I am very grateful. She opened the book and plucking a petal from the rose, dropped it between the leaves. Then looking up, she said gently, I cannot accept. It took Clifford a month to entirely recover, although at the end of the first week he was pronounced convalescent by Eliot, who was an authority, and his convalescence was aided by the cordiality with which Rue Barrée acknowledged his solemn salutes. 40 times a day he blessed Rue Barrée for her refusal and thanked his lucky stars, and at the same time, O wondrous heart of ours, he suffered the tortures of the blighted. Eliot was annoyed, partly by Clifford's reticence, partly by the unexplainable thaw in the frigidity of Rue Barrée. At their frequent encounters when she, tripping along the Rue de Seine with music roll and big straw hat, would pass Clifford and his familiars steering an easterly course to the Café Vachette, and at the respectful uncovering of the band would color and smile at Clifford, Eliot's slumbering suspicions awoke. But he never found out anything and finally gave it up as beyond his comprehension, merely qualifying Clifford as an idiot and reserving his opinion of Rue Barrée. And all this time Selby was jealous. At first he refused to acknowledge it to himself and cut the studio for a day in the country, but the woods and fields, of course, aggravated his case, and the brooks babbled of Rue Barrée, and the mowers calling to each other across the meadow ended in a quavering Rue Barrée. That day spent in the country made him angry for a week, and he worked sulkily at Julian's, all the time tormented by a desire to know where Clifford was and what he might be doing. This culminated in an erratic stroll on Sunday, which ended at the flower market on the Pont au Change, began again, was gloomily extended to the morgue, and again ended at the Marble Bridge. It would never do, and Selby felt it, so he went to see Clifford, who was convalescing on mint juleps in his garden. They sat down together and discussed morals and human happiness, and each found the other most entertaining. Only Selby failed to pump Clifford, to the other's unfeigned amusement. But the juleps spread balm on the sting of jealousy and trickled hope to the blighted, and when Selby said he must go, Clifford went too. And when Selby, not to be outdone, insisted on accompanying Clifford back to his door, Clifford determined to see Selby back halfway, and then finding it hard to part, they decided to dine together and flit. To flit, a verb applied to Clifford's nocturnal prowls, expressed perhaps as well as anything the gaiety proposed. Dinner was ordered at Mignon's, and while Selby interviewed the chef, Clifford kept a fatherly eye on the butler. The dinner was a success, or was of the sort generally termed a success. Toward the dessert, Selby heard someone say, as at a great distance, "Kid Selby, drunk as a lord." A group of men passed near them. It seemed to him that he shook hands and laughed a great deal, and that everybody was very witty. There was Clifford opposite, swearing undying confidence in his chum Selby. And there seemed to be others there, either seated beside them or continually passing with the swish of skirts on the polished floor. The perfume of roses, the rustle of fans, the touch of rounded arms, and the laughter grew vaguer and vaguer. The room seemed enveloped in mist. Then all in a moment each object stood out painfully distinct. Only forms and visages were distorted and voices piercing. He drew himself up, calm, grave, for the moment master of himself, but very drunk. He knew he was drunk, and was as guarded and alert, as keenly suspicious of himself as he would have been of a thief at his elbow. His self-command enabled Clifford to hold his head safely under some running water and repair to the street considerably the worse for wear, but never suspecting that his companion was drunk. For a time he kept his self-command. His face was only a bit paler, a bit tighter than usual. He was only a trifle slower and more fastidious in his speech. It was midnight when he left Clifford peacefully slumbering in somebody's armchair, with a long suede glove dangling in his hand, and a plumy boa twisted about his neck to protect his throat from drafts. He walked through the hall and down the stairs, and found himself on the sidewalk in a quarter he did not know. Mechanically he looked up at the name of the street. The name was not familiar. He turned and steered his course toward some lights clustered at the end of the street. They proved farther away than he had anticipated, and after a long quest he came to the conclusion that his eyes had been mysteriously removed from their proper places, and had been reset on either side of his head like those of a bird. It grieved him to think of the inconvenience this transformation might occasion him, and he attempted to cock up his head hen-like to test the mobility of his neck. Then an immense despair stole over him. Tears gathered in the tear ducts, his heart melted, and he collided with a tree. This shocked him into comprehension. He stifled the violent tenderness in his breast, picked up his hat, and moved on more briskly. His mouth was white and drawn, his teeth tightly clenched. He held his course pretty well and strayed but little, and after an apparently interminable length of time found himself passing a line of cabs. The brilliant lamps, red, yellow, and green, annoyed him, and he felt it might be pleasant to demolish them with his cane, but mastering this impulse he passed on. Later an idea struck him that it would save fatigue to take a cab, and he started back with that intention. But the cab seemed already so far away and the lanterns were so bright and confusing that he gave it up and, pulling himself together, looked around. A shadow, a mass, huge, undefined, rose to his right. He recognized the Arc de Triomphe and gravely shook his cane at it. Its size annoyed him. He felt it was too big. Then he heard something fall clattering to the pavement and thought probably it was his cane, but it didn't much matter. When he had mastered himself and regained control of his right leg, which betrayed symptoms of insubordination, he found himself traversing the Place de la Concorde at a pace which threatened to land him at the Madeleine. This would never do. He turned sharply to the right and, crossing the bridge, passed the Palais Bourbon at a trot and wheeled into the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He got on well enough, although the size of the War Office struck him as a personal insult, and he missed his cane, which it would have been pleasant to drag along the iron railings as he passed. It occurred to him, however, to substitute his hat, but when he found it he forgot what he wanted it for and replaced it upon his head with gravity. Then he was obliged to battle with a violent inclination to sit down and weep. This lasted until he came to the Rue de Rennes, but there he became absorbed in contemplating the dragon on the balcony overhanging the Cour du Dragon, and time slipped away until he remembered vaguely that he had no business there and marched off again. It was slow work. The inclination to sit down and weep had given place to a desire for solitary and deep reflection. Here his right leg forgot its obedience and, attacking the left, outflanked it and brought him up against a wooden board which seemed to bar his path. He tried to walk around it but found the street closed. He tried to push it over and found he couldn't. Then he noticed a red lantern standing on a pile of paving stones inside the barrier. This was pleasant. How was he to get home if the boulevard was blocked? But he was not on the boulevard. His treacherous right leg had beguiled him into a detour, for there behind him lay the boulevard with its endless line of lamps. And here, what was this narrow, dilapidated street piled up with earth and mortar and heaps of stone? He looked up. Written in staring black letters on the barrier was Rue Barrée. He sat down. 2 policemen whom he knew came by and advised him to get up, but he argued the question from a standpoint of personal taste, and they passed on, laughing. For he was at that moment absorbed in a problem. It was how to see Rue Barrée. She was somewhere or other in that big house with the iron balconies, and the door was locked. But what of that? The simple idea struck him to shout until she came. This idea was replaced by another equally lucid, to hammer on the door until she came. But finally, rejecting both of these as too uncertain, he decided to climb into the balcony and, opening a window, politely inquire for Rue Barrée. There was but one lighted window in the house that he could see. It was on the 2nd floor, and toward this he cast his eyes. Then, mounting the wooden barrier and clambering over the piles of stones, he reached the sidewalk and looked up at the facade for a foothold. It seemed impossible, but a sudden fury seized him, a blind, drunken obstinacy, and the blood rushed to his head, leaping, beating in his ears like the dull thunder of an ocean. He set his teeth and, springing at a windowsill, dragged himself up and hung to the iron bars. Then reason fled. There surged in his brain the sound of many voices. His heart leaped up, beating a mad tattoo, and gripping at cornice and ledge, he worked his way along the facade, clung to pipes and shutters, and dragged himself up, over and into the balcony by the lighted window. His hat fell off and rolled against the pane. For a moment he leaned breathless against the railing, then the window was slowly opened from within. They stared at each other for some time. Presently the girl took 2 unsteady steps back into the room. He saw her face, all crimsoned now. He saw her sink into a chair by the lamplit table, and without a word he followed her into the room, closing the big door-like panes behind him. Then they looked at each other in silence. The room was small and white. Everything was white about it. The curtained bed, the little washstand in the corner, the bare walls, the china lamp, and his own face, had he known it. But the face and neck of Rue were surging in the color that dyed the blossoming rose tree there on the hearth beside her. It did not occur to him to speak. She seemed not to expect it. His mind was struggling with the impressions of the room. The whiteness, the extreme purity of everything occupied him began to trouble him. As his eye became accustomed to the light, other objects grew from the surroundings and took their places in the circle of lamplight. There was a piano and a coal scuttle and a little iron trunk and a bathtub. Then there was a row of wooden pegs against the door with a white chintz curtain covering the clothes underneath. On the bed lay an umbrella and a big straw hat, and on the table a music roll unfurled, an inkstand and sheets of ruled paper. Behind him stood a wardrobe faced with a mirror, but somehow he did not care to see his own face just then. He was sobering. The girl sat looking at him without a word. Her face was expressionless, yet the lips at times trembled almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, so wonderfully blue in the daylight, seemed dark and soft as velvet, and the color on her neck deepened and whitened with every breath. She seemed smaller and more slender than when he had seen her in the street, and there was now something in the curve of her cheek almost infantine. When at last he turned and caught his own reflection in the mirror behind him, a shock passed through him as though he had seen a shameful thing, and his clouded mind and his clouded thoughts grew clearer. For a moment their eyes met, then his sought the floor, his lips tightened, and the struggle within him bowed his head and strained every nerve to the breaking. And now it was over, for the voice within had spoken. He listened, dully interested, but already knowing the end. Indeed, it little mattered. The end would always be the same for him, he understood now, always the same for him, and he listened, dully interested, to a voice which grew within him. After a while he stood up and she rose at once, one small hand resting on the table. Presently he opened the window, picked up his hat and shut it again. Then he went over to the rose bush and touched the blossoms with his face. One was standing in a glass of water on the table, and mechanically the girl drew it out, pressed it with her lips and laid it on the table beside him. He took it without a word and, crossing the room, opened the door. The landing was dark and silent, but the girl lifted the lamp and, gliding past him, slipped down the polished stairs to the hallway. Then, unchaining the bolts, she drew open the iron wicket. Through this he passed with his rose.